Hello. Today we are joined by Dr. Anna French, a managing partner at Qiming Venture Partners USA. After studying biochemistry at the University of Bristol and earning her DPhil in clinical laboratory sciences at Oxford and advising leading pharma and biotech at BCG, the Boston Consulting Group, Anna took a leap of faith in 2017 as a first employee of Qiming's U.S. Healthcare Venture Fund. Since then, the firm has raised over $550 million across 3 dedicated U.S. healthcare funds and invested in over 40 companies, with 11 significant exits. Quite an adventure, and I'm really excited to have you on the podcast to learn more about it. Welcome to the NextGen VC Podcast, Anna.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you both for having me, and thank you also for all the great work you guys and your colleagues do to support initiatives like this with the broader community. I think it has a great impact. So yeah, well, thank you for being part of this.
Let's dive right in. So I want to start with your time at Oxford, because I thought it was quite interesting that while you were there, you took on a role managing the Translational Stem Cell Consortium, which sounds like a pretty big deal to me. That sounds quite unique. Can you tell us what that involved, and how did you do that while you were still in graduate school, and also maybe what did the experience teach you and how did it impact your later years?
Sure, absolutely, Jen. And I don't think we talked about this, but as I was finishing up my undergraduate degree, I actually tried to get a job as a patent attorney in the UK. So I applied to. I think it's different in the UK because I think in the US you have legal training, right? But in the UK, at least, maybe this is where I went wrong. But anyway, people from purely scientific disciplines went into the field, and so I applied to a whole bunch of patent attorney firms, and I actually think I got to the last round with some company in London, but I didn't get a job. And so, I think the reason I had done that was I was interested in sort of the science plus business concept, I guess. And I realized throughout that process that maybe it would be helpful to have a PhD. And so I went to Oxford, where we didn't have PhDs. We had DPhils, but anyway, it's basically the same thing. It is the same thing. And then to your question, so as I sort of started at Oxford, I quickly realized that, the cells were fascinating, the mice were cute, but really what I wanted to do was kind of get outside the lab. And what was pretty cool then, and I think, the UK's innovation ecosystem at the time and still today is somewhat smaller perhaps than here in the US. I mean, everything is smaller, but in Oxford, which largely is ran, my thesis committee was not my actual team, but the overall at my college, I was reporting up to a historian, right? So this is Oxford, right? So very esteemed colleges, and there wasn't a lot of innovation until what sort of biotech innovation around the campus, around the city, until an organization got launched by a guy named Dan Perez, who is now the CEO and founder at Hinge Health. At the time, he was an Oxford DPhil student. And this may sound like an aside, but I'm getting to your question. So Dan had launched, Dan's an American. He had come to Oxford and launched what was at the time called the Oxford Biotech Roundtable. And what OBR did at that time, it built sort of chapters around the UK and Oxford and Cambridge and London, and then at some point in the US, and sort of brought innovation, ecosystem sort of to the universities. And so at one point I ran the Oxford chapter, and we were doing, there was a business plan competition that we partnered with SR1 to do. There was Jan's Eckstein at the time that Dan led. We were doing some consulting for local biotech firms. We were doing a bunch of, we did a publication, just really trying to build a bit of an ecosystem that didn't exist. And I will, I'm still in contact with a good half a dozen people from that effort. And so I was spending more and more time with these types of people and getting to know, local biotech companies in Oxford. And as my network began to build, I met a couple of people who were at that time starting this new center that was really part of Oxford plus UCL, University College London, where the intention was to focus on topics that kind of bridge that translational gap, right? So clearly we have great science going on in Oxford and other places. And I think the view was that there was still a big, gap between that and what industry you wanted to engage on, which I think is still true. And so anyway, so Oxford UCL collaboration was called CASME, the Center for Accelerated something. And within that, we started this project that was focused initially on sort of stem cells and then more broadly cell therapy. And what that really looked like was, me and a couple of the people who were involved with it early on, we effectively went and pitched pharma. We worked with Celgene, with GE, with CCRM in Canada and some other groups, and said, we have the right, the connections to go and help answer some questions that you have as cell therapy has begun to enter the clinic, right? So CAR-T was getting some attention. I think pharma realized that this was going to be a different model to developing small molecules or biologics. And so we had a real kind of privilege to, work with some of the leading academics at the time who were here. And, now I'm here in Boston, in Stanford, and then also do some work in Korea and Japan where some of these programs had been progressed. So it was a phenomenal experience because I was, in the room with, VPs and leaders in pharma, really understanding what they had on their minds. So we did work in areas such as standardization, manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. And I think not to spend the whole conversation on this first topic, but what that kind of led to for me was a number of things. One was, I actually remember sort of hosting this great kind of event in Paris at the St. James's Club. I assume the St. James's Club is still there in Paris. It's a beautiful, beautiful venue. I would encourage you guys to hold something there soon.
Noted.
It was a roundtable of 30 execs or something like that, and we published a paper that sort of reported out on the discussion. And what was great for me on multiple fronts was I was the only sort of basically not even PhD yet in the room, right? Everyone else was PhD plus 20 years in industry plus whatever it might be. And so I kind of had a bit of a appreciation that, hey, maybe I need to to learn some of this other stuff quickly, right? Because this other stuff in drug development is, it's pricing, it's, marketing, it's, regulatory, it's everything else, right? And so that sort of sent me down the BCG path. But I also learned, at one point we held a meeting in Korea, and I got taken on this pretty fascinating tour of a local academic hospital where at that time the medical records were zooming around in like boxes above your head on these sort of like train tracks. And it was a great sort of exposure to how different markets, develop certain products or certain technologies in different ways, and sort of what we can learn from those interactions, whether it be, in Stanford, in a hospital in Korea, in a sort of industry forum in Paris. I spent really just about two and a half years working in that context, like a year and a bit while I was still doing my PhD. And then I spent a year after it full time. But it was a great sort of exposure for me. And I think, we put out 12 plus publications. And I think, it was hopefully useful for some other people as well at that time.
Wow.
Oh, what a great story.
Yeah, I'm glad we dived into that on this podcast, even though we hadn't covered it in the pre-call. I wonder if your experience at BCG was as influential in setting you up for your path at VC. I don't know if you want to talk about, like what I think you said you're interested in learning more about the pricing and other aspects in BCG. Was that your actual experience? And also, was that when you moved to the US? Or
Yeah, I joined BCG in London originally. And sort of per my prior comment, my feeling was I needed to kind of round out my skill set. And, I could go to business school, but I didn't have any money. So maybe I should go and get a job. So, it was, I applied to McKinsey and BCG, and BCG were recruiting kind of off cycle. And I was very fortunate to join the London team. And it was a great experience, right? I think what I mostly enjoyed was the breadth of exposure you really get across different projects, different customers, different problems, really. To me, in London, we spent a bunch of time at the beginning. I was kind of, I just wanted to do healthcare. And at the time, at least, the consultants, the kind of, the non-partner level people were generalists. And so the first project I got sent on was a banking case to HSBC, or at least some other bank in Canary Wharf. And so, there you're kind of sitting in board meetings, fascinating kind of exposure. I worked with, then I purely worked with global biopharma. And what I really enjoyed there was, I was working in New York for a global biopharma company, trying to work, working on this regulatory case where, the substrate was, wasn't sort of, it was focused on marketing authorizations post acquisition of, a pharma had acquired another company, and they had to align their marketing authorizations with the labels, with the manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. So not necessarily like the type of topic that I would have necessarily sought to work on. But what was really interesting in that example was, I was often flying out to Dubai, and it was really a case of how do you get these disparate markets to work together, right? So we have people in Egypt, people in Jordan, people in other areas of the Middle East, and different cultures and different kind of expectations for working style. So I think for me at BCG, having those type of exposures beyond the sort of, the subject matter that was obviously very important was just a great overall experience. And then to your point, Jen, with BCG, I took the opportunity to move to the Boston office, really in search of a biotech company. And how would I, my my now husband wanted to move to New York, and I insisted that the biotech was only going on in Boston. And so we came here, and I was, started conversations with biotech companies, trying to work out if that's, could be my next move.
Okay, so you didn't necessarily want to go into venture, but then somehow you became the first employee at Qiming, right? How did that happen?
Yeah, and I think the theme, as you guys know, and a lot of this is obviously like the power of a network. And I grew up in a small town near Manchester, so I did not have a great network in our industry, for any reason other than having kind of walked this path. But I arrived in Boston. I worked for about a year and a half ish at BCG, at various local clients in the area. And then I started networking, right? So I would go to a bunch of the different events that were happening here, and I was applying to a bunch of biotech companies, and I was mostly applying for sort of BD roles. But I quickly learned that I didn't have a deal sheet, right? I'd been a consultant. Most small companies needed a single person with a deal sheet. Like larger companies might have a junior and a senior, et cetera, et cetera. But I ran into a bunch of VCs, and I'd been running into VCs in the UK as well, and thought like, how cool is that? But honestly, had not thought to seek such a role myself. But then through a bunch of conversations, and I actually got connected to Mark McDade, who's the one of the co-founders here at Qiming, through Arjun Goyal, who I've taken him to a couple of dinners since to thank him. But Arjun was at that time founding Vita Ventures. And Vita and Qiming kind of launched their first funds back in 2017. So I connected with Mark, and it just seemed, I think for me it was, I already had a bunch of friends at Third Rock and places like great firms, and I think I knew what that role looked like. But to me, to join a firm that was launching just seemed like an opportunity I didn't want to pass on. Plus, I have I don't say a obsession with the East, but an interest in how this sort of global context works. And so, it was kind of an obvious to join Qiming. I think I remember actually I turned down another offer and said, I'm going to Qiming to this individual. And he said to me, why? Why are you going to this place that I've never even heard of that sounds unpronounceable? And a few years later, he came up to me and said, Anna, you made a great choice. And I said, yes. And as you know, most of it is about the people, and most of it was about a new firm. It was about, the exposure to a global context, but it was really about, Mark McDade and to some extent, Gary, who I knew I could learn an awful amount from in a sort of heavily mentorship based business.
One of the things I find very interesting about this, Anna and Jen, is in some ways a nonlinear path that everyone follows. When you came out of undergrad, you thought about being a patent attorney. That didn't work out, so you adapted, and you went to grad school. You set up this consortium. You went to the Boston Consulting Group. Looking back, what would you say this was sort of being constantly prepared and adaptable, or just how circumstances sort of buffeted you in different directions? When you look back at how you ended up, is there advice that you could give to people thinking about this? Is it about being prepared and adaptable to different circumstances? Is it always having a North Star that you follow? How would you sort of characterize that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think what I meet a number of grad students here, and, they say to me, I want to go into venture. And, yeah, at that time, when I was I guess at grad school, but earlier on, I barely even knew what these things were, to be honest. And so I think it's great to say I want to go into venture, but I think the question is always like, yes, venture can be a very rewarding profession, but how and what, right? Because ultimately, as guys know, there are different firms with different approaches and different roles in different firms. And so I think it's more about like the skill sets that you want to build along the way and then how you want to utilize them than per se a specific role in a specific industry. So I definitely think there's sort of some of my experience has been opportunities arise and you take them, right? Which I would always advise anyone to, particularly if it's working with people who can accelerate you or support you, right? I think that's always a key. But then perhaps up to your point, to the general point, having a bit more openness with regard to, you want to go into venture, but maybe what you want to do is go and take an operating role and kind of learn from this great person that has had multiple experiences before you go into venture, or maybe you just want to take a slightly longer path to the same place because it ultimately is a different place, right? So I definitely think, openness to multiple routes is typically beneficial, and really working out how are you going to be helpful to others, right? How are you going to have a differentiated background than just, some of the basic kind of CV criteria?
Yeah, exactly. I can imagine that being the case. One of the like Jen had suggested, started off with, Anna, you were the first employee at Qiming. Now, I always imagine, we had a lot of clients that the first employees do everything. They answer the phones, they empty the garbage, they do a wide variety of things. What's it like being the first employee or two at a venture fund? Is it you have to wear many hats or?
Yeah. No, and I think I started and I was just down the road, sitting here in Cambridge, but I was just down the road at the CIC buildings when I joined and when the fund launched in Cambridge, and it was just me and Martin McDade. So day one he was traveling somewhere, so I remember getting a phone call from our then CFO in Hong Kong, and I was just generally confused. I kind of wondered, like, so Mark Medade had previously, prior to launching Qiming, had been the chief operating officer at UCB, which is, at least today, a $50 billion-ish market cap company. So I thought, he's used to having teams working for him. Like, am I going to your point, need to take out the trash and, I don't know, answer the phone? We didn't have a phone. But Mark, Mark is very able to he can go it alone. He can run large teams. And so, we didn't have an assistant. We didn't have so I was doing some scheduling at certain times. So there was definitely an element of just all hands on deck. But I appreciate a lot about who Mark Medade is as a person. But I think, what was also great was I wasn't just doing essentially like the grunt work of what needed to be done from day one. I was kind of interacting across the whole,
That's awesome.
across the whole stack of activities that we needed to do as a venture firm, whether that's, diligencing or meeting entrepreneurs or, calling KOLs, etc. But it was a great, it is, and it was a great place to be, whereby, you're defining your direction on a sort of almost daily basis, right? Like you're determining your strategy, you're working out like who you think you can be and how you think you can have an impact, both from a, obviously a value creation perspective, but also from a, finding your own place on the map, right? And I think that's been a wonderful, wonderful experience.
What was a good challenge that you had to navigate in those early days?
Well, so we launched the fund as Qiming US, right? And I think the number of people that could pronounce Qiming in the first, I would say probably 5 years was probably not even 1 in 10. So, we spent a lot of time in those days explaining like who we were and, how to pronounce the name and how we were different from the China firm, which, we still do to this day. Obviously today there's no question, does China matter in biotech? The answer is undoubtedly yes. back in 2017, there were quite a few cross-border funds, but there wasn't a sort of example of a fund that had been built in China and then been built here in the US, as a separate fund. So I think a lot of the challenges and the opportunities came from, I wasn't in venture prior to this, so I had some network, but not, definitely not the fulsome network that was needed. Mark had been in, CEO, COO, various different biopharma companies, so he knew the ecosystem, but not per se in this venture role. Gary Rachel, who was the other co-founder, had built, he built the Qiming funds, he built some of the SoftBank funds, but he'd been in China for 20 years. So we sort of had to kind of take all the different skill sets around the table and apply them into a new sort of focus area. And in that case, no one person really had the answer, but it was sort of, a team sport.
So, Anna, in 2020, you became partner. Is that right at Qiming?
Yeah.
Has anything changed? Because you've been there the whole time, it's probably sort of an evolution. Was it sort of a step function going from pre-partner to partner? Or maybe tell us a little bit about how your daily life has changed since becoming partner.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest change to my daily life since 2020 was I had my first child. But anyway, but on the partner topic, I think as a principal, I had been, and we have principals in the firm today who are leading deals. So I'd already led deals. I'd already taken board seats. I think what was different was, I now had a role on the investment committee. So obviously not just pitching, but you're sort of making decisions at the fund level on the areas that you are investing in, the investments that you are making, as well as a seat at the table amongst the sort of, small partner team with regard to everything from, hiring, budget setting, strategy, vis-a-vis how are you deploying this fund? How do you think about going to raise the next fund? So, I kind of, entered the room where some of those decisions were being made. And I think, great to have those experiences, and happy to talk about some of them if that's of interest. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think you might be the first one that I'm going to ask this question, but what's it been like to interact with LPs and raise a fund? And I think you've been part of at least one or two fundraisers, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so we've raised 3 funds at Qiming US, and I was lucky to be in the room. I mean, I'm not generally quite quiet, but lucky to be in the room for the first fundraise because I think there's a whole almost new language to learn when you're talking to institutional investors. So we have raised from primarily US institutions, whether they be endowments, family foundations. We have a pension fund, etc. But that's a very different, again, sort of set of players and almost language to what the ecosystem that we kind of generally spend our time in. And so, if I had gone from a standing start into those conversations to lead a fundraise or to at least participate in a fundraise, I think I would have been sort of lost at sea. Because there's, really terminology around like how they think about capital allocation and specific kind of metrics. So, I think the first fund I was kind of more in a watching kind of mode, and then fund 2 and 3 I helped to raise. And I think it's a fantastic discipline. I mean, I wish fundraising was easier in a sense, but I think it's great to kind of put the shoe on the other foot as we get to be. Someone once told me they liked venture because they're top of the totem pole, which I'm not sure is a great answer. The reality is, unless it's
all perspective.
Yeah, exactly. And if you have to raise capital, you're not top of the totem pole, right? Like they are. I think it's a good kind of exercise to go out and say, like, why should we be able to raise additional capital, and like, how are we going to deploy it, and why does it matter, and how are we going to generate returns? And then it's another whole network that you have to kind of cultivate and understand and try to build out as well.
Do you think fundraising from LPs is similar to the relationship that entrepreneurs have with fundraising from VCs? Like, what are some similarities and differences?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Jenna. And I think, there are similarities and differences. I think, on the similarity side, like you have to be good at telling a story. You have to be, effectively good at marketing. It's sort of a double-sided coin on, if you're British, you think like Americans are like fantastic at marketing, marketing And then you hear, that the British have inspire some confidence or something with the way we present. But ultimately, I personally am not a kind of natural marketeer. I have been, trying to learn how to be better at presenting and telling an exciting story. But I think the reality is, unlike in a biotech company raising a fund, you're generally speaking to, specialist investors, right? Like people like ourselves who, are committed to the class and are actively investing in companies in the space. I think when you're fundraising from, institutional LPs, it's, the last meeting was with a blockchain fund, and then they're going to talk about private credit, and then they're going to go and think about, investing in AI or something. So the reality is, you really kind of have to step back from, again, the language of our industry, which is like very quite technical, right? And I think kind of pull it up to the highest level of, their job is to generate returns, and how are you going to help them generate returns? And so I think, it's similar, but perhaps just a slightly different audience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a good reminder. And then that may help entrepreneurs think about, okay, how can I better pitch if I know what my VC investors will have to ultimately do? It's like when you're delivering work products, like who are you giving it to and what they're going to do with it, right? Should we talk about one of your investments? How about Umoja?
Tell us a little bit of how you found Umoja, how they came to you, and what made you excited about the company
Yeah.
and decided to invest in.
Yep. Yeah, and I think Umoja is a great example of sort of like this kind of global connectivity theme, because I actually got connected to Andy, the founder and CEO, by James Lee, who was at the time the CEO of JW Therapeutics in China. So, they're here in the US, I'm here in the US, but I get connected by a sort of leading China-based CEO, although James is now back in the US. And so I met Andy actually here in this very, very room, my sparsely decorated office, when they were raising their seed. And like Andy Scherenberg is a very, very impressive grasp of both the sort of scientific and clinical sort of space. And from day one, I thought, wow, this is interesting. But at the time they raised the seed, they were focusing on a few different platforms that still exist within Umoja, but there was a bit more of a focus on sort of the need to like build cars that had a shielding element to it. And we just felt like the shielding was going to be technically a pretty challenging bar. And so we didn't invest in the seed, but it was one of those ideas that you just can't, at least from myself, I often wake up thinking about things that I thought about at work, sadly. And so the seed had progressed, but I kind of kept going back to, well, isn't this a space that we should be in? And we did some work on at the time. So Umoja is an in vivo CAR T company with a lentiviral based platform. And at the time, there was another company called Tidal, which is an LNP RNA-based platform that Sanofi subsequently acquired. And so by looking at these two profiles, we kind of said, like, which is the platform that we think is ultimately, the right play for us in this space. And so as we did that work and as we kind of continued to build conviction, I was in Seattle a couple of times and had lunch with Andy and just said, hey, do you want to raise a round? And so we co-led the Series A and been very, just been a wonderful story to be a part of.
Amazing. I think one of the things I thought was interesting is that Umoja, like pretty early on, decided to build their own manufacturing facility, right? And then even now, like others are trying to be really capital light. Like, what are your thoughts around biotech manufacturing and how that might evolve here in the U.S. given the current state of the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as we underwrote that initial investment into Umoja, I think the questions we tried to ask ourselves were sort of, I already mentioned one question, like what's the right platform we believe to be able to engineer T cells in the patient? The second one was, how many T cells would you need to engineer, right? So we're all familiar with the autologous context of how many cells you put in a patient, but clearly this was going to be different. And so, back of the envelope, like how many cells are you going to need to engineer? And then thirdly, like how would we manufacture this? And so obviously there was experience with lentiviral manufacturing for autologous CAR T in places like Oxford Biomedica. But, Umoja was taking a different approach with regard to like different glycoproteins and different things that would impact the manufacturing. And so we spent a bunch of our time in our diligence, kind of trying to understand how feasible this would be from a manufacturing perspective. And having spent a lot of kind of, I did my PhD in sort of induced pluripotent stem cells. I ran this, stem cell consortium at BCG. I worked on various advanced, therapy projects, and the reality there is, so many times programs fail because of the manufacturing, right? And so this was front and center. I think fast forward to today, it is a incredible capability to, when you're manufacturing it, it obviously comes at a cost, right? But I think, with regards to ability to move truly innovative products forwards, then, you gain a lot of control by having your own manufacturing, particularly in a space where there aren't sort of, half a dozen vendors that are available to utilize today. Obviously that will change over time, but we had many board meetings discussing whether we wanted to invest on the capex kind of front here, and ultimately, hindsight suggests it was the right decision. And I think companies that haven't made that level of investment, until the space matures a little bit, will probably continue to struggle.
Along those lines, Anna, since you have been with Umoja for such a long time, and you probably have seen it evolve with both Umoja and other companies that you work with, does an investor's role with the company evolve over time from an early stage company to a more mature company, or does it stay pretty much the same? How, maybe give us some characterization of that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I do think it depends on the company. More broadly than Umoja, when you see the company lead the early round as an investor, then I think you're just kind of in the bullpit, as it were, sort of helping think through all of the important decisions early on, sort of helping, more broadly than Moja for sure, but helping think about, hiring, like helping with hiring, helping, with regards to connections that might be helpful for BD or otherwise. And so I think as companies mature, they hire more, they fill out their C-suite, the board gets bigger, and so the role, you take more of a step back, right, and take more of a just a sort of singular board level role, which is kind of more advisory and sort of governance, overview of a governance, than perhaps in those early stages when everyone's sort of trying to bring capabilities to the table to help navigate tough problems.
I'd love to like touch on something you mentioned earlier, which um, we had talked about before that you really have had a lot of global experiences. You've talked about going to Korea, and obviously you started your career in the UK. And there's really two questions on that. One is like, you know, what's one thing that you wish other investors who may not have a global perspective understand or value? And then also like, how has how have you taken that global perspective in the work that you do?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think one learning for me early on was, you're kind of, wherever you grow up and whatever your context, like you sort of have a certain way of thinking about things. But the reality is that there's actually multiple different ways of thinking about things, right? And different cultures and different, geographies like tend to provide more extremes with regard to like that sort of, basis, right? And so that might sound a little philosophical, but I think it just creates a slightly more open mind with regard to, not just what matters, but how to construct something, for sure. Um, and I think in that kind of context, understanding, I guess, I don't want to call it strengths and weaknesses, because I think that's perhaps not the right characterization, but understanding what a certain geography is really good at, or a certain institution, for example, I've never worked there, so I'll just give it as an example. But like, the Fraunhofer in Germany is kind of known for its engineering capabilities, right? It's just an example of a core strength. I think understanding the core strengths that exist, that kind of sit around the globe, and not just the strengths but the experiences, right? So I gave the example of, Korea and Japan at the time had been the first to commercialize a cell-based therapy, right? That is an experience. And so I think as entrepreneurs, obviously there's a lot of US-China conversations, kind of really going beyond just, like, let's look at assets and just really understand, like, what are the core competencies that exist in different markets, and how can we better leverage them? How can we better partner to bring those into, to deliver on what we care about? I think, people could definitely spend more time thinking about that.
Yeah, I'm definitely gonna give you a compliment here because I was talking to somebody about how I was excited to interview you, and they commented that they felt like you were able to just pull what appears to be like disparate threads. You just have a lot more foresight into that and somehow pull them all together in your line of work. And I think people kind of see it after the fact and like, oh, that all makes sense. And I think maybe your global perspective and like that flexibility of seeing the different things, including like motivations, like maybe a area has a particular known strength and therefore they're extra motivated to do something where they're not as well known, right? Like those things can really help you um be creative and like problem solve in a changing dynamic, right? So um
Yeah, I think some of that, it sort of applies to to biotech investing in its essence, right? It's sort of like, what are the fundamentals and like, what are you going to build conviction from? I think, it's in such a complicated industry, it's kind of easy just to, well, not easy, but it's sort of, I think people often get kind of caught in the, hopefully the tailwinds, not the headwinds. But, I think there are areas where there's some success and then it breeds another 20 companies with some variation on that thing. And people kind of generally, I think, see it as, well, it's that area is being de-risked. But the way I see it is the bar has just gone up, right? And so it's much, better to, in my view, kind of focus on fundamentals and think about where that next kind of step or wave of innovation is going to come from, then trying to compete in a place where there are another like 30 companies and, you kind of hit or miss sort of based off like two points on some kind of clinical score in a phase 2, right? I think that's just a very hard place to play.
yeah, I mean I read this article where they just commenting that a lot of venture, especially when the economy is bad, they just want to like go after de-risk assets, and they were commenting whether VCs were even really chasing that alpha anymore. So it's great to see that there's still a lot of folks who are committed to finding the new areas and kind of driving the market along.
So we're seeing a lot of challenges and opportunities, depending on whose perspective. Maybe from a U.S. entrepreneur's perspective, the worry about the rise of the Chinese biopharma and their ability to rapidly develop drugs at in a much more cost-effective basis. How do you view that? I mean, you're not directly related to the Qiming China venture, but you must see a lot of Chinese opportunities and stuff like that. From an investor perspective, how do you counsel people in the U.S. that are on where you're on the board of these U.S. based companies uh, about Chinese biopharma and how to should they be feared? Are they just good competition? Maybe a perspective on China biopharma uh, advice that you might give to a U.S. based company.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, the the fear in general should come from the stats of our industry, right? Which is like 90% of drugs that enter the clinic fail. I mean, that should give us all fear, right? With regard to scrutinizing every data set that, emerges, whether it be, some mouse study or whatever. I think sort of relative to China, I think people should understand sort of both the competitive lens. Like, we've always asked the question, companies present to us here in the US and they say, these are our competition. So that competition should be a global perspective, right? There's no reason why you should only include, US competition. But I think what people, what biotech companies should spend more time thinking about is, well, how can we leverage that, right? So clearly, depending on what type of company you are and, where you are in development, on the drug discovery side, there's an opportunity to partner with companies in China and maybe work on that sort of second program that you couldn't otherwise underwrite with the dollars that you've raised. On clinical development side, there's an opportunity to go faster, earlier, et cetera, et cetera. So I think companies that don't take advantage of these types of opportunities will ultimately get kind of left in the dust unless they, kind of they're in the 1% to kind of, we really de-risked an incredible product. But, ultimately people need to be informed and people need to be, accessing capabilities that just because they sit in China doesn't mean you shouldn't think about how to access them.
That makes sense.
You've been involved in a lot of other companies beyond cell therapy. I know we spent a bit of time talking about Umoja, but Maybe you can talk about some of the other investments that you've made and also like where do you see things going? I think you've made some investments that are in digital health, for example. Let's
Yeah,
leave it open ended here.
sure. Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So we've since the first fund have been investing in sort of health tech. Some people call it digital health. The majority focus is biotech. But I think, and we have a number of investments, of some of which I was involved in that, are very successful companies that are more easily measurable by revenue than a lot of the space that we otherwise exist in. So it's been a great sort of, I don't want to say diversification of the portfolio, but it's been a great area to basically, entrepreneurs have come to us because we understand to some extent, biopharma. And so most of the investors they otherwise raise from are tech investors or digital health investors. And so there's been a nice kind of synergy that has been found there. But I think even more, even more in a more exciting fashion, on a go forward basis, there are so many opportunities to leverage some of these sort of health tech or non-therapeutics companies kind of insights into drug development, right? And so, obviously a lot of talk about AI and a huge inflection that has occurred, for the not for our space particularly, but for the entire, globe, as of a couple of years ago. And I think, there's a lot more to come. And to me, a lot of that comes from unlocking, discrete and valuable data sources, right, that can be deployed, whether it's, biology or otherwise. So, I've probably been involved in or made, 10, 12, 13 investments, a number of which have been seed companies, some of which have transitioned, some of which haven't. And so, I'm still excited by, as I mentioned before, like unlocking new areas. So the investment I made most recently, last year was actually a company called Renaissance, which is focused on ADPKD, autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease. And we got excited in that because we've been incubating a company in the sort of somatic genetics space. So that, basically is, we're all familiar with using genetics for target discovery purposes, right? And that's germline genetics, like the genetics we all get born with. But I think there's increasing evidence to show that our genetics actually continues to evolve over time. Particularly if you have a disease of inflammation or, inflammatory type disease. And so we've spent a bunch of time thinking about looking at these mutations that occur in ulcerative colitis or, any sort of inflammation disease. And that kind of led us to think about, well, what are the known, somatic mutations today? And one of them is ADPKD, which is a very sort of large, rare disease. And a great team that was put together to really go after this problem, which was sort of a proximal to CF space, right? Effectively stabilizing or correcting a mutated protein that in this case is PC1, PC2. So I think, what I was talking to our teams about, we are generalist investors, as it were, but I think insights come from doubling down into areas. So that example, we've been incubating this somatic genetics company, but we ended up at Renaissance, right? So I think, by trying to get to sort of key insights, I think you are able to kind of, again, unlock sort of additional incremental value.
What's one of your secrets, Anna, to staying on top of technology? I mean, it's quite a diverse range of technologies that you invest in and that you work with. What's your secret for staying current on all these trends and technologies?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure some people would tell you about a bunch of podcasts and blogs that you should read that I don't read, which I wish I did if I had more time. But I mean, obviously, I read the general the main publications and journals. But I think it's more about being out there interacting with great scientists, and then when you hear something, move on it, right? Like if you hear something that seems interesting, then have a follow-up conversation or connect some dots or go and think a bit more about that thing that's interesting. I think it's, pulling the threads is perhaps more productive than trying to canvas, the landscape. You don't need to invest in everything that's exciting. You kind of need to invest in a couple of things that really, that really work.
Yeah, sort of touching a little bit on the time element. You had spoken a little bit earlier about one of the things is that the biggest change in your life was when you had your kid rather than making partner. So just kind of curious for young VCs that are out there that are thinking about starting a family. Any advice that you could give to people on how to manage work-life balance that has worked for you?
Yeah, and actually, as I, I've done many sort of jobs in my life, and one of the, I got involved in this project, somewhere between before BCG at some point, and it was really a small project focused on women leaders, women CEOs mostly, and sort of the question of like how do they do it, right? Like some of them had kids, some of them didn't, but and as I interviewed some of these people, um, what you hear most often is, well, they have a very supporting partner, right? Like the partner does a lot of, helps a lot with the children, et cetera, et cetera. And, I have a wonderful husband, but he is a CEO and founder of a venture-backed startup. So he doesn't, he doesn't do the supporting role. We both do the, trying to do everything role to some extent. But so I think, I guess my general advice is, you know, these are all, yeah, I find the professional life we have is very fulfilling. Children are very fulfilling. So, go for it, right? And, navigate it along the way. Clearly, it's helpful if you have a supporting partner or supporting, I don't know, grandparent or supporting help, right? Like these are all important things. I also think it's, it's hopefully is generally not discouraging, but it's a struggle doing all these things. Honestly, I would describe it as a privileged struggle, right? Like it's like there's no balance. There is only, I basically flip between work and kids, and it's exhausting, but it's very rewarding. And so I think if you go into things with your eyes open and appreciate, what are you ultimately trying to prioritize, right? Like at some point you might say, I want to prioritize more time with my kids and take a little bit of a step back. At some point you might say, well, I need to really prioritize, this particular project. And so you have to kind of take a step back from some other stuff. I think I personally have given up trying to find balance and, um, I just think, it's a matter of like what matters to you and how
Yeah,
you're going to spend your time.
that's awesome.
I love that.
I love that too.
Yeah, so going back to, the roots of Qiming, it was a Qiming fund in China, right? And I'd love to just understand, or maybe you can share with the listeners a little bit more about your perspectives of US versus China, and also what you hope will evolve if let's look forward in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah,
What are your hopes
no,
there?
absolutely. And I think, that, a lot of the focus in the last couple of years has been on asset licensing, right? The model has been set up a US NewCo and license assets from China. And a lot of, I think that continues to be for certain, groups quite productive, and a number of programs have been moved forward successfully in that manner. We see this asset licensing as really the tip of the iceberg. I think the China biotech ecosystem has matured, and these companies are more than just, their first program or two. And so what we have been focusing on is really much deeper level partnerships where we're able to bring translational capabilities and teams from the US and pair it with the right drug development company in China and move beyond just asset and licensing to more of a fulsome, bill dependent on what the focus is. And so I think, my prior comment about, partnering on drug development, partnering on clinical trials, what we're doing with some of our newcos is really leaning into that opportunity set. And ultimately, the challenge with early stage drug development is it takes 6 years to get to the clinic. If we can shorten that to 3 or 4 years, then I think we have a lot more opportunity as a sector.
Do you think it's more, you're more dependent on the geopolitical relationship between the companies? Does that make you, do you open up the newspaper each day to see the blow by blow between the US and China, or is you just try to stay beyond that? I mean, maybe give us some perspective of,
Yeah.
because you have that relationship, is that, are you extra sensitive to that or not?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Mike. I mean, so we're an independent fund. So I think what Gary did with a lot of foresight was, created Qiming US as an independent fund. And so we're a US fund. We raise capital in the US. We're a US team. So we're a US fund with a Chinese sounding name. But, I think beyond that, and we brought on advisors that really work in this kind of US-China policy space that I think have a lot of looking around the corner capabilities. But beyond that, I think, we still believe that, there'll be ups and downs, but ultimately, healthcare is an opportunity for collaboration between these markets. And, while I cannot predict what executive order is coming around the corner, if we kind of organize our businesses in a relatively, de-risked fashion that can, partner appropriately, then I think we don't have to check the newspaper every morning, although we can't help it. But I think the risk is definitely somewhat managed.
I'd also be curious, like, what are some things? I mean, there's certain things in China that are not easily translatable here to the US, but, having the experience that you had, like, what are some things that you wish US entrepreneurs would adopt um, lessons from either China or actually even like the UK or other countries that like you've been observing and working with?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say like there are a lot of U.S. investors going to China right now, but I would encourage a lot of U.S. CEOs to go to China, right? Go to the Suzhou Biopark and see just how, like, honestly productive everybody is there. I mean, I think are employees in the U.S. about to start working 6 days a week, 9 hours a day? No, and I'm not suggesting that, but that that is the core capability of some of the people working in the Chinese ecosystem. So I would encourage people just to first of all get exposure and see what what other people are doing and what good can look like. I think the US has an incredible set of innovative and translational both biotech and academic teams that will continue to kind of be world leading there. But that alone is perhaps not enough.
Maybe to close it out, and sort of circling back to one of your first comments, you tested the waters with a career in patent law, and you ended up working with so many companies and stuff like that. Have you ever thought about what your life may have been like if you had gotten that job offer at a patent firm?
Great question. I'm sure it would have been equally as fulfilling as the current
Never
one.
look back.
Yeah.
Fact,
I
yes.
also rejected a career in patent law.
Exactly. Never look back is exactly right.
Maybe I have a nicer house in London right now. I don't know. Like maybe that would be
Yeah, Anna, well, thank you so much for your time today and sharing your incredible story and insights. I just was listening very rapt here. Before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts for or advice for our listeners? Is there a piece of advice that you wish you could give your younger self, if not more broadly to the other investors?
Yeah, and thanks both for having me. This is a wonderful conversation. I appreciate the time here. I don't know if you guys Peloton. I occasionally Peloton, and when you're doing like a Tabata ride or
I
something,
totally
the
do.
instructor will say get comfortably uncomfortable or something along those lines, right? And I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with taking a longer path anywhere. I think it's really down to what you find rewarding. But to take a shorter path, you almost have to get comfortably uncomfortable or something, right? And so I think it's whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, it doesn't really matter, but it's really just about taking on new responsibilities, exposing yourself to new people, and really just trying to, trying to embrace and engage with everything that's around us, which is, a privilege. So thanks, guys.
I love it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's going to be the theme of our talk: how to be comfortably uncomfortable. I think that's a great lesson. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to the NextGen VC Podcast. We are sponsored by Wilson Sonsini, the premier life sciences law firm. We're also sponsored by Launch Bio, a nonprofit organization that focuses on building better biotechs by creating connections between entrepreneurs and investors. Thanks to AJ Machado for engineering and producing today's podcast, and Steve Prutzman for providing our theme music, which comes from his Passengers album. Please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platforms. And finally, let's all do great work out there.
This episode may feature current or former clients of Wilson Sonsini. This podcast is for general informational purposes and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on as legal advice. The information in this podcast is not tailored to a particularized situation or jurisdiction, may not reflect the current state of the law, and should not be considered a substitute for the advice of your own legal counsel. You should not consider this podcast an invitation to form an attorney-client relationship, and no attorney-client relationship is created by your use of this podcast. Wilson Sonsini disclaims all liability in respect to any actions taken or not taken based on the content of this podcast, and notes that prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. This podcast may be considered attorney advertising in certain jurisdictions.